My mother stood up in a packed courtroom in front of a judge and declared that I was legally obligated to pay my brother's mortgage because of something she called a family promise. I watched her confidently point at me as she told the court that I had verbally agreed to support David financially for life. What she didn't know was that sitting 3 rows behind her was Jessica Chen, my college roommate who had become one of Phoenix's most respected family law attorneys, and she had been quietly documenting every lie my family had told over the past 6 months. They thought they could manipulate the legal system the same way they had manipulated me for years, but they were about to learn that courtrooms don't care about guilt trips or emotional blackmail. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started on a Tuesday morning when I was reviewing code at my desk in our Tempe office, completely absorbed in debugging a payment processing system that had been giving our team trouble for weeks. I loved these quiet moments at work, the satisfaction of solving complex problems piece by piece, the steady hum of productivity around me. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother Carol, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the tone. Emergency family meeting tonight. Your father and I need to discuss something important with you. Don't make other plans. No hello, no please, just a command wrapped in the illusion of urgency. I stared at the message for a moment, feeling that familiar knot form in my stomach that always appeared when my family used words like emergency and important. In Mitchell family language, these terms rarely meant actual emergencies. They usually meant David had created another crisis that somehow required my immediate attention and financial intervention. I typed back a simple, "What's the emergency?" but received no response for hours. That silence told me everything I needed to know about what kind of evening awaited me. The day dragged on as I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting to possible scenarios. Had David lost another job? Was there a medical emergency? Had something happened to the house in Glendale, where my parents still lived? By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I had convinced myself that maybe this time it really was serious. That maybe I was being paranoid about my family's pattern of manufactured crises. The drive from Tempe to the chain restaurant in Glendale, where we always held these family discussions, took me through the familiar landscape of suburban Phoenix, past strip malls and housing developments that all looked remarkably similar. I had suggested meeting at the family home, but my mother insisted on neutral ground, which should have been another red flag. The Mitchell family only required neutral ground when they were planning an intervention of sorts, when they needed the social pressure of a public space to keep everyone civil. I arrived at the restaurant first, as I always did, and requested a corner booth where we could talk without being overheard. The hostess, a young woman probably not much older than my brother, led me to a table near the back of the dining room. I ordered a coffee and sat there watching families enjoy normal dinners, couples sharing desserts, teenagers laughing over endless breadsticks. There was something both comforting and isolating about observing all this ordinary happiness, while waiting for whatever drama my family was about to unfold. My parents arrived 15 minutes later, my father Tom walking slightly behind my mother as he always did when she was in full executive mode. Carol had been a high school principal for 30 years before retiring, and she still carried herself with that particular authority that comes from spending decades managing teenagers and their parents. She spotted me immediately and approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind of expression she probably used on parents who had been called in to discuss their child's misbehavior. "Sarah, honey, thank you for coming on such short notice," she said, sliding into the booth across from me while my father settled beside her. Tom nodded at me with that apologetic expression he wore whenever Carol was orchestrating one of these family meetings. He had learned long ago that his role was to provide silent support for whatever position my mother had decided to take. "So what's the emergency?" I asked, deciding to skip the small talk that would inevitably lead to the same destination anyway. "Is everyone okay? Is there a health problem I should know about?" Carol reached across the table and patted my hand in that condescending way that suggested I was being dramatic for wanting direct answers. "Everyone's fine, sweetheart. We just need to talk about David's situation, and we felt it was important to do this in person rather than over the phone." There it was, David's situation. Not a medical emergency, not a family crisis. Just another installment in the ongoing saga of my younger brother's inability to manage his own life. I felt my shoulders tense as I prepared for whatever request was coming. Over the years, these situations had ranged from helping with car payments to covering credit card debt to providing security deposits for apartments he couldn't afford. What kind of situation? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the general category if not the specific details. My father cleared his throat, which was usually his signal that he had been designated to deliver bad news while my mother prepared to present the solution. David's been having some trouble with his mortgage payments. The bank sent a notice last week about beginning foreclosure proceedings if he can't catch up on what he owes. I blinked slowly, processing this information. David had bought his house in Scottsdale 3 years ago during his brief period of success as a pharmaceutical sales representative. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom home with a pool and a 3-car garage, exactly the kind of place that impressed his girlfriend Amy and their circle of friends who seemed to measure success entirely by square footage and monthly payments. Even at the time, I had wondered how he could afford the payments on his income, but David had always been confident about his earning potential. How far behind is he? I asked, dreading the answer. 6 months, my mother said quietly. He owes just over $19,000, and they want it all at once, or they'll start the foreclosure process next month. The number hit me like a physical blow. $19,000. I had that much in my savings account, money I had carefully accumulated over years of living below my means, driving a used car and avoiding the kind of lifestyle inflation that had apparently caught up with my brother. But having the money and being willing to hand it over to solve someone else's problem were entirely different things. What happened to his job? I asked. Last time we talked, he was doing well with the pharmaceutical company. Tom and Carol exchanged a look that suggested this was where the story got complicated. He's been between positions for about 6 months, Carol said carefully. The pharmaceutical industry has been going through some changes, and his territory was eliminated. Between positions. That was family code for unemployed, though it sounded more dignified and temporary. I wondered how long they had known about this situation, and why they were just telling me now, when the problem had apparently reached crisis level. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I genuinely was. Despite our complicated family dynamics, I didn't want David to lose his home or face financial ruin. What's his plan for finding new work? Has he been interviewing? Is he considering other industries? Another look passed between my parents, and I realized that this conversation was about to take a turn I wasn't going to like. Carol leaned forward slightly, moving into what I recognized as her persuasion mode, the tone she probably used when convincing reluctant parents to support new school policies. That's actually why we wanted to talk to you, she said. David is working on getting back on his feet, but these things take time. The job market is competitive, and he doesn't want to just take anything that comes along. He's built a career in sales, and he needs to find the right opportunity. I felt a familiar frustration building in my chest. David needed to find the right opportunity, as if he was in a position to be selective when his house was about to be foreclosed on, as if the rest of us hadn't spent years taking whatever work was available when we needed money. So what exactly are you asking me? I said, though I suspected I already knew. Carol reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which she smoothed out on the table between us. It appeared to be a printout of David's mortgage statement, complete with the outstanding balance and payment schedule. We were hoping you might be able to help him catch up on the payments, just temporarily, until he gets established in a new position. I stared at the paper without touching it. The monthly payment was $3,200, not including insurance and property taxes. Even if I paid the $19,000 to bring him current, he would need another $3,200 every month going forward, and there was no guarantee when or if he would find work that could sustain that kind of expense. Mom, that's not just a temporary help situation, I said carefully. Even if I paid the back payments, he'd need ongoing support to keep the house. What happens next month when he still doesn't have a job? He'll have a job by then, Carol said with the kind of confidence that suggested she had convinced herself this was true through sheer force of will. David is a good salesman, and the economy is improving. It's just a matter of time. I looked at my father, hoping for a more realistic assessment of the situation, but Tom was studying the table surface as if it contained important information. He had learned over the years that disagreeing with Carol's optimistic projections about David was not a conversation he wanted to have in public. "Have you talked to David about other options?" I asked. "Could he sell the house and find something more affordable? Could he get a temporary job while he's looking for sales work?" The suggestion clearly offended Carol, though she tried to hide it behind a concerned expression. "Honey, you can't just ask someone to give up their home. David has put a lot of work into that house, and the market isn't great for selling right now. He'd lose money, and then where would he be? Where would he be? He would be in the same position as millions of people who had made financial decisions they couldn't sustain and had to adjust their living situations accordingly. He would be in an apartment he could afford, instead of a house that was bankrupting him." But I could see from my parents' expressions that this was not the kind of practical solution they were looking for. "And as for temporary work," Carol continued, "David has a professional reputation to maintain. He can't just take any job that comes along." What would that look like to potential employers in his field? I felt something shift inside me, a recognition that this conversation was not really about helping David through a temporary crisis. This was about maintaining an illusion of success that my family had invested in. Regardless of the financial reality, David couldn't sell his house because that would mean admitting he had overextended himself. He couldn't take temporary work because that would damage his professional image. The only acceptable solution was for someone else to subsidize his lifestyle until the universe provided him with exactly the right opportunity. "How much would you need?" I heard myself asking, though I wasn't sure why I was even engaging with this request. Carol's face brightened immediately. "Well, ideally the $19,000 to catch up, and then maybe just a few months of payments while he gets established. 3 or 4 months at most. 3 or 4 months at $3,200 each, plus the $19,000 to catch up." She was talking about potentially $32,000. More than half of everything I had saved over the past 5 years. Money I had set aside for my own emergencies, my own future, my own security. "That's a lot of money, Mom," I said quietly. "We know it is, sweetheart. And we wouldn't ask if we had any other options. But you're doing so well with your job. And you don't have the same expenses David has. You're single, you live in that small apartment, you don't have a family to worry about." There it was. The implication that my financial stability was somehow accidental, that my careful spending and modest lifestyle meant I had money to spare rather than money I had deliberately saved. The suggestion that because I didn't have David's expenses, I should be willing to take on David's obligations. I thought about my small downtown apartment, which I loved precisely because it was affordable and allowed me to save money. I thought about my used Honda Civic, which I drove because it was reliable and practical rather than impressive. I thought about all the dinners I had cooked at home instead of going out, all the vacations I hadn't taken, all the small sacrifices I had made to build some financial security for myself. "I need to think about this," I said finally. Carol's smile faltered slightly. In her experience, family emergencies required immediate solutions, and thinking about it was just another way of saying no, while trying to sound reasonable. "Of course, honey. We're not asking for an answer right now. But the bank wants to hear from David by the end of next week, so we can't wait too long. The end of next week. 7 days to decide whether to hand over years of careful saving to subsidize my brother's Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Refusal to adjust his lifestyle to match his income. 7 days to choose between my own financial security and my family's approval. As we left the restaurant that night, I hugged my parents goodbye and promised to call them soon with my decision. But as I drove home through the quiet Phoenix streets, I realized that I had already made my choice. The question wasn't whether I could afford to help David. The question was whether I could afford to keep enabling a pattern that would never end, as long as someone was willing to provide bailouts, instead of requiring accountability. The next morning, I called my mother and told her I wouldn't be paying David's mortgage. The conversation was brief and cold, ending with Carol's prediction that I would regret choosing money over family. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning. and that my simple no would trigger a series of events that would ultimately expose just how far my family was willing to go to get what they wanted. The phone calls started the very next day. Not angry calls, not emotional outbursts, but something far more calculated and persistent. My mother began what I could only describe as a strategic campaign designed to wear down my resistance through a combination of guilt, manipulation, and social pressure. She had clearly given this considerable thought, because each conversation followed a slightly different approach, as if she was testing various psychological tactics to see which one might crack my resolve. The first call came during my lunch break while I was sitting in the small break room at our office, enjoying a quiet sandwich and scrolling through some technical documentation for an afternoon meeting. When I saw Carol's name on my phone screen, I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but I knew that would only delay the inevitable and probably make the eventual conversation more intense. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral and professional despite the knot that was already forming in my stomach. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I realize we might have overwhelmed you with all the details about David's situation." Her voice was warm and understanding, the tone she probably used with confused parents during her principal days. "I wanted to call and make sure you understood that we're not asking you to solve this problem permanently. We're just looking for some temporary assistance while David gets back on his feet." I set down my sandwich and rubbed my forehead, recognizing the shift in strategy. Last night, she had presented this as an emergency that required immediate action. Today, it had become a reasonable request for temporary assistance between family members. The problem was exactly the same, but the framing had been carefully adjusted to make my refusal seem less justifiable. "Mom, I understand what you're asking," I said carefully, "but $19,000 plus monthly payments isn't temporary assistance. That's taking on someone else's major financial obligation." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds much more dramatic than it really is," Carol replied with a little laugh. "We're not asking you to take on David's obligation permanently. We're asking you to help your brother during a difficult period in his life. Isn't that what families do for each other?" There it was. The fundamental question that my mother used like a weapon whenever she wanted to compel behavior that couldn't be justified on its own merits. Isn't that what families do for each other? The implication being that refusing her request meant I didn't understand or value family relationships, that I was somehow deficient in the basic human capacity for loyalty and love. Families do help each other, I agreed, but they also expect each other to be responsible and accountable. David bought a house he couldn't afford, and now he's expecting someone else to pay for it rather than making the hard choices he needs to make. "That's not fair, Sarah." Carol's voice had cooled noticeably. "David didn't choose to lose his job. He didn't choose for the economy to be difficult. These things happen to good people, and when they do, families step in to help." I wanted to point out that David had chosen to buy an expensive house without adequate financial reserves. He had chosen to remain unemployed for 6 months rather than taking temporary work. He had chosen to maintain an expensive lifestyle instead of adjusting his spending to match his circumstances. But I could already sense that this conversation was heading toward the same circular argument that had characterized so many of our family discussions over the years. "I need to get back to work," I said finally. "Can we talk about this later?" "Of course, honey. I just wanted you to know that we love you, and we appreciate everything you've done for this family over the years. I know you'll make the right decision." The call ended on that note, with Carol's confident assumption that the right decision was obviously the one she wanted me to make. I sat in the break room for a few more minutes, staring at my half-eaten sandwich, and thinking about the phrase, "everything you've done for this family over the years." It was true that I had helped various family members with various financial problems over the past decade. Car repairs for David, a security deposit when he moved apartments, credit card payments when he overspent during the holidays. Smaller amounts, usually presented as emergency situations that required immediate assistance. Looking back, I could see a clear pattern of escalation. Each crisis had been slightly larger than the last. Each request had pushed the boundaries of what seemed reasonable just a little bit further. And each time I had helped, I had reinforced the idea that Sarah was the family's financial safety net. the responsible one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own security for everyone else's comfort. The second call came that evening, just as I was settling into my apartment after a long day of debugging and testing. This time it was my father, which was unusual because Tom rarely initiated phone conversations about family issues. His role was typically to provide silent support for whatever position Carol had taken, not to advocate independently for family policies. "Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said when I answered. "I wanted to talk to you about David's situation, just the two of us." This was clearly part of the coordinated campaign. Carol had tried the reasonable approach earlier, and now Tom was being deployed to provide a different perspective, probably the emotional appeal or the man-to-man practical assessment. "Sure, Dad. What's on your mind? I know your mother talked to you earlier, and I know she can be pretty intense when she sets her mind on something." Tom's voice carried that familiar apologetic tone he used when acknowledging Carol's more aggressive tactics without actually criticizing them. "But I wanted you to know that we really are worried about David. Not just financially, but emotionally. He's been pretty depressed since he lost his job, and the stress of potentially losing his house is really getting to him." I felt a pang of genuine concern. Whatever my frustrations with David's financial irresponsibility, I didn't want him to be suffering emotionally. Depression was a serious issue, and the shame of financial failure could certainly contribute to mental health problems. "Has he been talking to anyone about the depression?" I asked. "A counselor or therapist?" "Well, you know how David is about that kind of thing," Tom said with a sigh. "He doesn't really believe in therapy. He thinks he just needs to get back to work and everything will be fine. But in the meantime, he's just sitting at home feeling bad about himself instead of taking any action to improve his situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I realized that my question had touched on something Tom didn't want to address directly. "He's been looking for work, Sarah. It's just a tough market right now." "What kind of looking?" I pressed. "Is he working with a recruiter? Has he been networking? Is he applying for positions outside his preferred industry?" Another pause. "I don't know all the details of his job search. I just know that he's been trying, and it's been frustrating for him." I suspected that Tom didn't know the details because there weren't many details to know. In my experience, people who were actively and aggressively looking for work had plenty of specific information about their efforts. They could tell you about applications they had submitted, interviews they had scheduled, networking events they had attended. Vague references to trying and market conditions usually indicated a much more passive approach to job searching. "Dad, I'm sympathetic to David's situation, I really am. But giving him money isn't going to solve his depression or teach him how to manage his finances better. If anything, it might make things worse by enabling him to avoid dealing with the real issues." "Sometimes people just need a little help to get back on their feet," Tom said quietly. "I know you worked hard for your money, and I know we're asking a lot. But David is family, and family takes care of family." There was that phrase again. Family takes care of family. As if the concept of family obligation only flowed in one direction, from the responsible members to the irresponsible ones. As if David's failure to take care of himself somehow created an automatic obligation for me to take care of him instead. "I understand that, Dad. But taking care of family doesn't mean protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do is let someone face their problems and figure out how to solve them." "Maybe," Tom said, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. "I just hate to see him lose everything when his sister could help him keep it. His sister could help him keep it. Not his sister should help, or his sister had an obligation to help, but simply the factual observation that I had the financial capacity to solve this problem." Which was true, but irrelevant. I also had the financial capacity to pay for a lot of other people's problems, but that didn't create a moral obligation to do so. "I'm not trying to punish David," I said. "I'm just not willing to take responsibility for choices I didn't make." We ended the conversation on that note, with Tom expressing his hope that I would reconsider and me promising to keep thinking about the situation. But I wasn't really thinking about it anymore. If anything, the coordinated nature of these calls was strengthening my resolve. The fact that my parents felt the need to tag team me with different approaches suggested that they understood my initial refusal was serious, and that simple emotional appeals weren't going to change my mind. The third call came 2 days later, and this time it was David himself. I was surprised to see his name on my phone screen, because David rarely called me directly about anything, let alone about his personal problems. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant, the kind of sibling connection that maintained itself through holiday gatherings and family events, but didn't involve much day-to-day communication. "Hey, Sarah," he said when I answered. His voice sounded tired and defeated, which immediately made me feel guilty for screening his calls over the past few days. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not bothering me, David. How are you doing?" "Well, I've been better," he said with a bitter laugh. "I guess Mom and Dad told you about my situation with the house." "They did. I'm sorry you're going through this. Losing a job is always stressful, especially when you have major financial obligations." "Yeah, it's been pretty rough. I never thought I'd be in a position like this, you know? I always figured if I worked hard and did well, everything would work out." I found myself softening toward him. Whatever my frustrations with his financial decisions, David sounded genuinely distressed, and I could hear the confusion and disappointment in his voice. It was possible that he really hadn't understood the risks he was taking when he bought such an expensive house, that he had genuinely believed his income trajectory would continue upward indefinitely. "What are you doing to try to turn things around?" I asked, hoping the question sounded supportive rather than judgmental. "I've been applying for jobs every day," he said. "It's just a really competitive market right now, especially in pharmaceutical sales. A lot of companies are cutting back or restructuring their sales teams. Have you considered looking outside pharmaceutical sales? Maybe something in a different industry that would use your sales skills?" There was a pause, and when David spoke again, his tone had become slightly defensive. "I've built my career in pharmaceutical sales, Sarah. I can't just throw that away and start over in some random industry. It would be like going backward. But if you're not finding opportunities in pharmaceutical sales, maybe going backward temporarily would be better than losing your house." "That's easy for you to say," David replied, and I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice. "You have a stable job in a growing industry. You don't have to worry about maintaining professional relationships or protecting your reputation." I bit back my initial response, which was that I had a stable job because I had chosen a practical career path and worked hard to develop marketable skills. Instead, I tried to focus on the immediate problem. "What other options have you considered? Could you refinance the mortgage to lower the payments? Could you take in a roommate to help with expenses?" "I've already talked to the bank about refinancing, but my credit has taken a hit since I stopped making payments. And as for a roommate, Amy thinks it would be weird to have a stranger living in our house." Amy, David's girlfriend of 2 years, who had moved in with him about 6 months before he lost his job. I had met her a few times at family gatherings, and she seemed nice enough, though she had struck me as someone who was very concerned with appearances and social status. The idea that she would find a roommate weird suggested that she was more interested in maintaining the illusion of affluence than in finding practical solutions to their financial problems. "What about Amy?" I asked. "Is she working? Could she contribute more to the household expenses?" Another pause, longer this time. "Amy has her own expenses. She's trying to build her photography business, and that takes time and investment." Photography business. I wondered if that was a real business with actual clients and revenue, or if it was the kind of creative pursuit that people use to avoid taking traditional employment. Either way, it sounded like David was supporting both himself and Amy on unemployment benefits while she pursued her artistic interests. "David, I have to ask this, and I hope you don't take it the wrong way, but have you considered that maybe the house is just too expensive for your current situation? Even if you find a new job, there's no guarantee it will pay enough to comfortably afford a $3,200 mortgage payment." "I can't just give up my house, Sarah." David's voice had become strained, almost desperate. "This is my home. I've put everything into this place. Amy and I have plans for the future, and those plans include this house." Plans for the future. I wondered what kind of plans required a specific house, especially one that was causing so much financial stress. But I could hear in David's voice that this wasn't really about practical considerations anymore. The house had become a symbol of his success, his identity, his relationship with Amy. Losing it would mean admitting failure on multiple levels, and he wasn't emotionally prepared to do that. I understand that the house is important to you, I said carefully. But sometimes we have to adjust our plans when circumstances change. Look, Sarah, I know Mom and Dad already talked to you about this, and I know you're probably tired of hearing about my problems. But I'm asking you directly, as your brother. I need help, and you're the only person I know who could provide it. I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay you back as soon as I get established in a new position. There it was, the direct appeal brother to sister, with a promise of repayment that we both knew was unrealistic. David had no way of knowing when he would find a new job, let alone whether that job would pay enough for him to maintain his current lifestyle and repay a loan of potentially $30,000 or more. David, I care about you, and I don't want to see you lose your house. But I can't take on the responsibility for your mortgage payments. That's not fair to either of us. So you're just going to let me lose everything? The desperation in his voice was palpable now, and I could hear the beginning of tears. You're going to sit there in your comfortable situation and watch your brother become homeless? You're not going to become homeless, I said firmly. You're going to have to make some difficult decisions and adjust your lifestyle, but that's not the same thing as being homeless. Easy for you to say. You don't have anything at stake here. That stung, because it was so fundamentally unfair. I had plenty at stake. I had my financial security at stake, my retirement savings, my emergency fund. I had worked for years to build the comfortable situation that David was now dismissing as irrelevant to his crisis. David, I do have things at stake. I have my own financial security to think about. I have my own future to plan for. Your future is secure, he said bitterly. You have a good job. You live in a cheap apartment. You don't have any real responsibilities. You could help me and never even notice the money. Never even notice the money. $19,000 plus monthly payments of $3,200. And I would never even notice. The casual dismissal of my financial planning and sacrifice was breathtaking in its audacity. That's not true, David, and it's not fair. I notice every dollar I spend because I work hard for my money and I'm careful about how I use it. Fine, he said, his voice now cold and angry. I guess I know where I stand with my family. I guess I know who I can count on when things get tough. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone and feeling like I had just been emotionally manipulated and then punished for not responding the way David wanted. The conversation had started with what seemed like genuine distress, and had quickly devolved into guilt trips and accusations. By the end, I was being portrayed as selfish and uncaring, simply because I wasn't willing to bankrupt myself to solve his problems. I set the phone aside and tried to return to the project I had been working on, but I couldn't concentrate. David's words kept echoing in my mind, particularly his accusation that I didn't have any real responsibilities. It was such a perfect example of how my family viewed my life choices. Because I had remained single, lived modestly, and focused on my career, they assumed that my financial stability was somehow accidental or unearned. Because I didn't have David's expensive lifestyle, they believed I had money to spare rather than money I had deliberately saved through discipline and planning. The pattern was becoming clear. Each family member was taking a different approach to the same goal, wearing down my resistance until I agreed to pay David's mortgage. Carol had tried the reasonable family assistance angle. Tom had tried the emotional depression concern. David had tried the direct brotherly appeal followed by guilt and anger. But none of them had addressed the fundamental question of why David's poor financial planning had become my responsibility to fix. That night, I called my college friend Jessica Chen, whom I hadn't spoken to in several months. Jessica and I had been roommates during our junior and senior years, and we had maintained our friendship even as our careers took us in different directions. She had gone to law school while I pursued software development, but we still got together occasionally for dinner or drinks when our schedules allowed. Sarah, it's so good to hear from you, Jessica said when she answered. How are things going? Are you still loving the job at the startup? Things are good with work, I said. But I'm actually calling because I wanted to get your perspective on a family situation that's been developing. Uh-oh. Family situations usually mean drama. What's going on? I explained the entire situation, from the initial restaurant meeting to the escalating phone calls over the past few days. Jessica listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or disapproval as I described the various tactics my family members had employed. "Wow," she said when I finished. "That's quite a coordinated campaign they've got going there. And they want you to pay how much? Potentially $30,000 or more, depending on how long it takes David to find work. For a house he can't afford in Scottsdale. Does he have any other assets? Could he sell the house and buy something more reasonable?" That's what I suggested, but apparently that would be giving up his dreams and admitting failure. Jessica was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking through the legal and practical implications of the situation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In any of these conversations, have your parents or David suggested that you have some kind of legal obligation to help? Have they mentioned any previous agreements or commitments you might have made?" The question struck me as odd. "No, nothing like that. Why would they? There's no legal obligation for siblings to pay each other's mortgages." "You're right, there's no general legal obligation. But sometimes families create informal agreements or expectations that can become complicated if they're later disputed. I'm asking because I've seen cases where family members claimed that verbal agreements or patterns of behavior created binding obligations. That's ridiculous. I never agreed to support David financially, and the help I've given in the past was always clearly described as temporary assistance for specific emergencies." "I'm sure you're right," Jessica said. "I just wanted to make sure there weren't any conversations or commitments that might be misinterpreted later. Family financial disputes can get ugly, and people sometimes remember agreements very differently when money is involved." Her warning turned out to be more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. The silence lasted exactly 4 days. 4 days of blessed peace where my phone didn't ring with family emergencies, where I could focus on my work without wondering what new emotional manipulation tactic was being deployed against me, where I could actually relax in my apartment without feeling like I was under siege. I should have known it was too good to last. On Friday morning, I arrived at my office to find Marcus Thompson, my boss and the founder of our small tech startup, waiting by my desk with a concerned expression. Marcus was typically a laid-back guy who managed our team with a light touch, so seeing him look genuinely worried was unusual and immediately put me on alert. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes to talk?" he asked, gesturing toward his office. "There's something I need to discuss with you." I followed him into his glass-walled office, my mind racing through possible work-related issues that might require this kind of formal conversation. Had I missed a deadline? Was there a problem with a client? Had someone complained about my work? I settled into the chair across from his desk, trying to read his expression for clues about what was coming. "I got an interesting phone call yesterday," Marcus began, leaning back in his chair. "A woman named Carol Mitchell called and identified herself as your mother. She said she was concerned about your well-being and wanted to make sure you weren't under too much stress at work." My stomach dropped. I could feel my face flushing with embarrassment and anger as I realized what had happened. My mother had called my workplace to discuss my personal life with my boss. She had crossed a boundary that I hadn't even known needed to be explicitly established. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I have no idea why she would call you. What exactly did she say?" Marcus held up his hand in a gesture that suggested he understood this wasn't my fault. "She said that your family was going through a difficult time and that you were being asked to help with a financial situation. She was worried that you might be feeling pressured to make decisions you couldn't afford, and she wanted to make sure your job was secure and well compensated." The brilliance of the strategy was immediately apparent. Carol had managed to contact my boss under the guise of maternal concern while simultaneously gathering intelligence about my financial situation. She wanted to know how much I earned, how secure my position was, and whether I had any work-related expenses that might limit my ability to help David. "She asked some questions about your salary and benefits," Marcus continued. "I told her that I don't discuss employee compensation with anyone, including family members, and that if she had concerns about your well-being, she should talk to you directly." "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. She wanted to know if you were being fairly compensated for your work, if you had any major expenses related to your job, if you were planning to stay with the company long-term. She also asked about your work schedule and whether you seemed stressed or overwhelmed. My mother had essentially conducted a financial investigation of my employment situation, using my boss as an unwitting source of information. She had probably been trying to determine whether I was being honest about my financial constraints or whether I was simply being selfish about money I could easily afford to share. Marcus, I am so embarrassed about this. My family is pressuring me to help with a financial situation, and I've been saying no. Apparently, my mother decided to go around me and get information directly from my workplace. Sarah, you have nothing to be embarrassed about. Your family situation is your business, and I made it clear to your mother that I wouldn't discuss your employment details with anyone. He paused, studying my face. Are you okay? She seemed to think you were under a lot of pressure. I considered how much to tell him. Marcus was not just my boss, but someone I respected and trusted, and his concerns seemed genuine. At the same time, I didn't want to burden him with the details of my family dysfunction or create any impression that my personal problems might affect my work performance. I'm fine, I said finally. My brother is having financial difficulties, and my family wants me to help in a way that I'm not comfortable with. I've been saying no, and apparently that's caused some frustration. Marcus nodded slowly. Family money issues can be really complicated. Are you sure you're okay? You don't seem like yourself lately. It was true that I had been distracted and less focused than usual. The constant phone calls and emotional manipulation had been taking a toll on my concentration and energy. I had been losing sleep, worrying about the situation, and trying to figure out how to handle the increasing pressure without completely destroying my relationships with my family. I'm managing, I said. I appreciate your concern, and I'm sorry my mother involved you in this. It won't happen again. Don't worry about it. But Sarah, if you need some time off, or if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. You're a valuable member of our team, and I want to make sure you have the support you need. I thanked him and returned to my desk, but I couldn't concentrate on my work. The realization that my mother had contacted my workplace felt like a fundamental violation of boundaries that I hadn't even known existed. It was one thing to pressure me through family channels, but involving my professional life crossed a line that made me genuinely angry for the first time since this whole situation had started. During my lunch break, I called Carol directly. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting for my call. Sarah, honey, I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling about everything? I'm feeling angry, I said without preamble. I just learned that you called my boss yesterday to discuss my personal finances. That is completely inappropriate, and I need you to understand that you cannot contact my workplace about family matters. There was a brief pause, and when Carol spoke again, her voice had taken on that patient, condescending tone she used when she thought someone was overreacting to her perfectly reasonable behavior. Sweetheart, I was just concerned about you. You seemed so stressed during our last conversation, and I wanted to make sure you weren't being taken advantage of at work. I thought maybe your boss could help me understand whether you were being honest about your financial situation. My financial situation is none of your business, and it's certainly not something you should be discussing with my employer. You had no right to call Marcus. I had every right to be concerned about my daughter's well-being, Carol replied, her voice becoming sharper. If you had been honest with us about your finances from the beginning, I wouldn't have needed to do my own research. My own research. She had described her boundary-crossing investigation as research, as if gathering intelligence about my income and expenses was a reasonable response to my refusal to pay David's mortgage. Mom, I have been honest with you. I told you I'm not comfortable taking on David's financial obligations. That's not a lie, and it's not something that requires investigation. Sarah, I know you think you're being practical, but you're not seeing the bigger picture here. David is your brother, and he's in real trouble. Your father and I aren't going to be around forever, and when we're gone, you and David will only have each other. The emotional manipulation was becoming more sophisticated now. Carol was moving beyond immediate guilt trips and into existential fears about family loyalty and long-term relationships. She was suggesting that my refusal to pay David's mortgage was somehow a rejection of our entire family structure. That's exactly why I can't bail him out, I said. If David and I are going to have a relationship as adults, it needs to be based on mutual respect and responsibility, not on me constantly rescuing him from his own decisions. You're being selfish, Sarah. You're putting your own comfort ahead of your brother's actual needs. I'm putting my own financial security ahead of David's refusal to live within his means. Those are not the same thing. Carol was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold and measured. I hope you're proud of yourself. I hope you're proud of choosing money over family. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, realizing that the conversation had just shifted into new territory. Carol was no longer trying to persuade me or manipulate me into changing my mind. She was expressing genuine anger and disappointment, as if my refusal to pay David's mortgage was a personal betrayal that had damaged our relationship beyond repair. That evening, I received a text message from David that simply said, "Thanks for nothing." No explanation, no context, just a bitter expression of resentment that made it clear he had been briefed on my conversation with Carol. The next morning, I woke up to find that my phone had been buzzing with missed calls and text messages throughout the night. 3 calls from my father, 2 from David, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. The text messages were a mixture of family guilt and increasingly desperate appeals. Tom had written, "Sarah, please reconsider. David is talking about just walking away from the house and declaring bankruptcy. Is that really what you want?" David had sent, "I hope you can live with yourself when I'm sleeping on someone's couch because my own sister wouldn't help me." The unknown number had left a voicemail that turned out to be from Amy, David's girlfriend. Her voice was tearful and angry as she explained that David had been crying all night, that he felt abandoned by his family, and that she couldn't understand how I could be so heartless when I had the power to solve this problem. The coordinated nature of the campaign was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't just spontaneous family concern anymore. It was a calculated effort to overwhelm me with guilt and pressure until I capitulated. Each family member had been assigned a different emotional angle, and they were all being deployed simultaneously to maximize the psychological impact. I spent the weekend in my apartment, ignoring the phone calls and trying to focus on other things. I cleaned obsessively, reorganized my closets, and worked on some personal coding projects that I had been putting off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was under siege, that my family was slowly but systematically destroying my peace of mind in order to get what they wanted. On Sunday evening, I received an unexpected visitor. My father showed up at my apartment door looking tired and defeated. Tom had never come to my place unannounced before, and his presence immediately signaled that the family campaign was entering a new phase. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I asked, letting him into my living room. "I wanted to talk to you face to face," he said, settling heavily into my couch. "This whole situation is getting out of hand, and I think we need to find a way to work things out." "What do you mean, getting out of hand?" Tom rubbed his forehead, looking older than I remembered. "David has been talking about just abandoning the house and filing for bankruptcy. Your mother is convinced that you're being manipulated by bad influences who are telling you to prioritize money over family. And Amy is threatening to leave David if he loses the house." Each piece of information was clearly designed to increase the pressure on me. David's bankruptcy would be a family shame that I could have prevented. My mother's theory about bad influences suggested that my decision wasn't even my own. Amy's threat to leave David meant that I would be responsible not just for his financial ruin but for the destruction of his relationship. "Dad, none of those things are my responsibility. David made the choice to buy a house he couldn't afford. Mom is choosing to interpret my financial boundaries as a personal attack. And if Amy would leave David over money problems, maybe she's not the right person for him anyway. Sarah, I know you're trying to be practical, but sometimes being practical isn't the same as being right. David is your brother, and he needs help. Real help, not lectures about responsibility. Paying his mortgage isn't help, Dad. It's enabling. It's teaching him that he doesn't have to face the consequences of his own choices because someone else will always bail him out." Tom looked at me with an expression that was part disappointment and part frustration. "When did you become so hard? When did you stop caring about what happens to your family?" The question stung because it was so fundamentally unfair. I cared deeply about what happened to my family, which was precisely why I wasn't willing to enable David's continued financial irresponsibility. But I could see that my father genuinely believed that caring about family meant sacrificing your own well-being for their comfort. "I'm not hard, Dad. I'm just not willing to set myself on fire to keep someone else warm. No one is asking you to set yourself on fire. We're asking you to help your brother keep his home. With money I worked years to save. Money that represents my own security and future. Tom was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was sad rather than angry. I don't know what else to say, Sarah. Your mother and I raised you to care about family, and we thought that meant helping each other when times got tough. Maybe we were wrong. He left shortly after that, and I was alone with the implication that my parents had failed as parents because they had raised a daughter who wouldn't bankrupt herself to solve her brother's problems. The guilt was overwhelming, but underneath it was a growing anger at the emotional manipulation that had been escalating for weeks. That night, I made a decision. I was going to stop responding to the phone calls, stop engaging with the guilt trips, and stop allowing my family to treat my financial boundaries as a negotiation. I was going to stand firm on my decision and let them adjust to the reality that I wouldn't be paying David's mortgage. What I didn't realize was that my family was about to escalate their campaign in a way that would make everything that had happened so far seem like gentle persuasion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.